Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. Evangelical Christians are an immensely powerful political force in America. But over the last few years, the number of people identifying as Christians, including evangelicals, has dropped pretty sharply. The data from the Pew Research Center backs that up. Now, some former evangelicals call themselves the Exvangelicals, which is the title of the new book from NPR's own Sarah McCammon, who is uniquely qualified to write about this group, seeing as she too was raised in the evangelical church, but no longer considers herself one. And in this conversation with NPR's Ayesha Rascoe, she touches on her own personal faith story, but also breaks down something that, on first glance, seems like a mathematical impossibility. How does the evangelical church keep losing members and yet maintain its stance as a political power player? That's ahead.
This message comes from Apple Card. You earn up to 3% daily cash on every purchase. That's 3% on products at Apple, 2% on all other Apple Card with Apple Pay purchases, and 1% on anything you buy with your titanium Apple Card or virtual card number. Visit apple.co/card calculator to see how much you can earn. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Terms apply.
NPR's Sarah McCammon loves Bible stories, especially those with strong women. The Book of Esther, that's a favorite.
Vashti was the queen's first wife, and he wanted her to parade around for him and his friends, and she said, no, thank you. And then, Esther was chosen as the replacement, and she helped save her people from death.
McCammon is well-versed in Scripture. She was raised as an evangelical Christian and left the faith tradition as an adult. Her background has intersected with her work, though. As one of NPR's national political correspondents, she frequently covers the Trump campaign and its evangelical supporters. Sarah McCammon has now written a book about the tensions within the white evangelical movement and how those tensions cause many followers to leave. It's called the Exvangelicals. The title comes from a hashtag used on social media. I asked her to tell us what it was like for her to grow up evangelical.
It was my whole world. And really by design. I think a lot of evangelical parents, mine and many others, felt like the world was fallen and sinful and something that children needed to be protected from. So my world was Christian school, church, Christian magazines, Christian books, Christian radio. Just, a sense that the phrase was we were in the world but not of the world, that we needed to be different. We needed to be removed in some way.
Growing up in a very conservative church, especially as a woman, there can be an emphasis on how you are to behave, where men are supposed to be the head, women are not. What were you taught about your place in the world?
I was very much taught, when you get married and have children, not if. And a woman's sort of greatest role was to be a wife and mother, that women were to primarily keep the house, take care of the family, that the family was supposed to be led by the father, who was the head of the household. And it was sort of this hierarchy of God, and then the father, and then the mother, and then the children. And we were also told, there was a lot of emphasis on purity and modesty, and this was for both men and women, but particularly for girls. There was an emphasis on covering up, making sure that you didn't tempt men. We were told that it was our responsibility to keep the men in our lives from looking at us the wrong way.
When did you start to question whether what you were growing up in was the only way?
There were lots of moments. I was aware from going to the library or public television that most people believed differently than we did. The biggest source of cognitive dissonance throughout my childhood was my relationship with my grandfather. He was one of the very few people I knew who was not a Christian. He had come out as a gay man late in life after my grandmother passed away. And this was in the 1980s. This was during the AIDS crisis. This was as the moral majority was on the ascent. And my parents were enmeshed in both the evangelical theological movement, but also the political movement. So, my grandfather just lived across town, but we didn't see him much because my parents were concerned that he would be a bad influence.
Do you feel like and not saying that it was just your grandfather, but that was part of the reason why you began to question, because when you see someone close to you who doesn't fit in with what your religion or your worldview says is acceptable, that can make you ask questions. Was that something common to the other people that you talked about, where someone would say, this was my breaking point, or this is why I couldn't continue on?
Yeah, it was interesting to see what those different breaking points were, and they were different for different people. I mean, for some people that I talked to the last few years, the intensifying politicization of the evangelical movement has been too much, whether it was the rise of Trumpism or feeling like their churches were not responding with adequate concern and seriousness to racial injustice or to the COVID pandemic.
You know, you almost can't talk about the evangelical movement without talking about it as, the white evangelical church versus, the Black evangelical church. You have a chapter where you write about race and evangelicals. And you also talk to some Black Christians who say they don't even consider themselves ex-evangelicals because they feel like they were never even really considered evangelicals.
Right. People like Dr. Jamar Tisby, who I interviewed for the book, he's a writer and podcaster. What he and others would say is that, that inclusion can't just be about, diversifying your pastoral staff. It has to really mean listening to the concerns and the stories of people who have a different lived experience. I think what the experiences of Christians of color call us to think about is the fact that some of these problems are systemic. They're not just individual. And I think you see that in, the fact that while many white Christians and Black Christians, you could even say Black evangelicals and white evangelicals hold similar theological beliefs, they vote very differently. And I think that indicates that the things that people prioritize are very different based on their lived experience.
When you talk about people leaving the evangelical faith, you cite a statistic from 2018 that says a third of those who grew up evangelical leave the tradition as adults. That shows that the ex-evangelical movement is not small, whether they call themselves that particular name or not, but yet looking around at politics these days, the evangelical movement seems more influential than ever. What do you make of that?
A couple of things. I mean, first of all, the decline in religiosity is true across most religions and certainly for white Christianity. But one of the things that Robbie Jones, who's an excellent writer and pollster with the Public Religion Research Institute, has argued about this is that in many ways, the Trump movement is a response to that declining cultural and demographic power of white Christianity, that it's sort of the last gasp of the Christian right to try to hold on to cultural power. And I think you start to see that around the time I was born, around the early 80s, with the increasing mobilization of white evangelicals as a political force. A lot of the rhetoric, as I document in the book, sort of harkened back to a time that was seen as more godly, where the country was a Christian nation. Once again, rhetoric that we're hearing more of now.
There was a line towards the end of your book that stayed with me. Quote, I believe God can handle our questions. And that's a strong statement because a lot of what you grew up with was being told not to question authority, not to question, what you're being told. How is your faith now?
I think it's always evolving and changing. As I say in the book, I feel that I'm forever shaped by my Christian background and that many of my values come from it. I still pray. I believe in something bigger than me, and I feel like I am open. I also don't feel any need to persuade other people to think the same way that I do.
That's Sarah McCammon, NPR national political correspondent and author of the new book, The Exvangelicals. Sarah, thank you so much for talking with us about your book and for writing the book and for all the work that you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Imagine a house where every room follows a different architect's plan. Doorways don't connect. Staircases lead nowhere. Lost Patients is a new podcast examining our complicated system for treating psychosis, one that loses patients to an endless loop between the streets, jail, and hospitals. We'll ask how it got so bad and how it can get better. Listen to Lost Patients from KOW and the Seattle Times, part of the NPR network.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Sony Pictures Classics presenting Wicked Little Letters, a new comedy starring Olivia Colman and Jessie Buckley based on an outrageously true scandal. Wicked Little Letters starts Friday in New York and Los Angeles, everywhere April 5th, only in theaters.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Rosetta Stone, an expert in language learning for 30 years. Right now, NPR listeners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership to 25 different languages for 50% off. Learn more at rosettastone.com/NPR.